Hey everybody. Uh, there was something that came to mind after I did my video yesterday that I meant to cover and didn't. I was really kind of preoccupied with what I was kind of pissed off about with the friend of mine that I mentioned and other people who come off with this perspective that if you don't vote for and express support for corporate Democrats, neoliberal Democrats over uh, right wing Republicans, which corporate Democrats are also right wing, as I've discussed before, uh, but they might be better in this or that way. But folks like to argue, liberal Democrats like to argue, well, if you don't vote for or express support for, or if you criticize such candidates, then you're privileged. And as I talked about yesterday, that's just absolute nonsense. And in fact, the real privileged people in this country are the folks who are well known and famous and wealthy and powerful, in most cases wealthy, who are pushing you so hard to support Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And what I want to talk to you about today is that's really kind of a pretense. The reality is that the Democratic wing of the ruling elite, the likes of Obama and the Clintons and Biden and Nancy Pelosi, the journalists that you see, the talking heads on MSNBC and CNN, the so-called liberal media outlets, even though they're right-wing in a lot of ways, they support the Democratic faction of the ruling class, and all their ideological cohorts that you may not have heard of, heads of or higher-ups in big corporations who lean Democratic and so forth. They don't care nearly as much about whether Donald Trump or Joe Biden wins the election in November as most liberal/moderate Democratic voters do. They don't care nearly as much as you think they do. And so I want to make the case here in the next few minutes that that is so, and try to explain why that's the case. So one thing to consider is that 2 elections in a row, the DNC has rigged the primary against the most popular politician in the country, Bernie Sanders, and also the politician who polled the best against Donald Trump. Now, I don't have a lot of time here. I don't want to take a lot of time to go into detail about that because I want to stick to the main issue here. I'll put some links in the description. But there's no question that in all likelihood, Bernie Sanders would have beaten Hillary Clinton and also would have beaten Joe Biden this time in a fair primary process. So just to briefly go over that, last time in 2016, as WikiLeaks documented, there was collusion between the Clinton campaign and the corporate media where they were feeding stories to the media that were favorable to Clinton and smeared Bernie Sanders. And there was a huge smear campaign against Bernie Sanders, both in 2016 and this time. And this time that smear campaign expanded to other modestly anti-establishment candidates, such as Tulsi Gabbard. There was also documented fundraising fraud in 2016, where money that was earmarked for other candidates down ballot in other Democratic races somehow wound up in Hillary Clinton's campaign fund. She raised well over $1 billion in the last election, and some of that money wasn't supposed to be her campaign's to use. There were also major discrepancies between exit polls and voting tallies in places that used machine voting. There was a lot of voter suppression where, for example, voters in heavily Sanders supporting districts such as Brooklyn, New York, were mysteriously thrown off voter registration lists. And there was also rigging this time in Iowa, and there was mysterious closing of polling places in districts highly favorable to Sanders, such as college towns and Hispanic-heavy districts in Texas and California and various other places. There were major discrepancies between exit poll results and voting results on numerous occasions in numerous states, where Biden would win way more than was predicted and Sanders would win way less than was predicted, or post-dicted, I guess, by exit polling. And then there was the little trick that the Democrats pulled where Obama called up all the other candidates in the Democratic primaries and persuaded them, or most of them, to drop out and endorse Biden. Almost every single one of them did. There are also hundreds of millions of dollars worth of free media coverage for Biden just prior to Super Tuesday. And one of the candidates who didn't drop out, Elizabeth Warren, basically managed to get enough votes in Massachusetts and some other states to deprive Sanders of victory in those states. Because even though, as we could talk about at length some other time, there were distinct political differences between Warren and Sanders, there was some overlap in their constituencies. Anyway, back to the issue at hand. My point is that the fact that the primary was rigged on 2 occasions against the candidate who almost certainly would have beaten Donald Trump had he been the nominee, and that would be Bernie Sanders, suggests that the Democrats cared more about stopping Sanders than they did about beating Trump. Cared more about beating Sanders in the primaries than beating Trump in the general. Another thing that we need to look at is that the Electoral College heavily favors Republicans due to primarily to the fact that there are 2 electors from every state who are senators, even in very sparsely populated states, and those sparsely populated states tend to be Republican. So that gives the Republicans an advantage in the Electoral College. In both 2000 and 2016, the Republican candidate won due to getting more electoral votes, despite losing the popular vote. In fact, decisively losing the popular vote in 2016. Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than did Donald Trump, that we know of. And Democrats aren't trying to get rid of the Electoral College, despite it putting them at a disadvantage and costing them at least 2 elections in modern, in the 21st century. 2 out of the last 5. Another thing to think about is the fact that voter suppression played a decisive role in the victories of Bush in 2000 and 2004 and Trump in 2016. You don't hear much about 2004 because John Kerry did actually lose the popular vote legitimately, we think, against George Bush. But there was sufficient rigging in Ohio that on that particular occasion where Kerry slightly lost, to Bush in the popular vote, he could have won if he had taken Ohio, but there was rigging in Ohio, so it went to Bush. Anyway, again, the point is, despite the fact that we have a clear instance of Republicans rigging the general election against the Democratic presidential candidate on 3 occasions, costing them the election, the Democrats don't talk about that very much and haven't really taken significant action to prevent it from happening again this time. And instead of focusing on Republican voter suppression, they blame Hillary Clinton's 2016 loss on unproven allegations of Russian interference, which, if you look at the evidence, really the only thing that there is a Russian company ran some very silly, poorly written, and unpersuasive ads on a very small scale that favored Trump and opposed Hillary Clinton. amounting to tens of thousands of dollars versus Clinton's more than $1 billion worth of campaign spending. And also the Democrats blamed their loss in 2000 and to some extent 2016 on the Green Party candidates in those elections, Ralph Nader in 2000 and Jill Stein in 2016. But they don't talk about other third-party candidates. The Libertarian candidate in 2016 got 3 times as many votes as Jill Stein did. So, not that we should be blaming third-party candidates or voters for third-party candidates at any time, because Democrats need to earn votes just as much as anybody else does. So it's not a voter's fault if they're not persuaded to vote for him. Another thing that Democrats don't make much effort towards that would help them if they did is they don't support ranked choice voting. So basically, ranked choice voting means that you rank your preferences for the candidates for a given office, first choice, second choice, and so forth. So that avoids any issues with people having a hard time deciding between the major party candidate and a third party candidate, and then they decide to vote for the third party candidate, and so the major party candidate doesn't get that vote. But under ranked choice voting, basically, the top 2 candidates, in terms of first and second choice votes and so forth, sort of have an instant runoff where the second choice votes count. If one of the top 2 vote getters among the candidates gets second choice votes, those votes count toward their total, and so people are free, therefore, to vote their conscience if they don't like either of the major party candidates, and they could still say, "Oh, I don't really like Joe Biden, but if it has to be between Biden and Trump, I'll make Howie Hawkins from the Green Party my first choice and Biden my second choice." So, if we had this election, then that person and Biden and Trump were the top 2 contenders, which certainly seems obvious that they will be, then that person's vote would be added to Biden's total, even though their first choice was Howie Hawkins. But anyway, the point is, if the Democrats really cared as much as they say they do about losing votes because people don't like their candidate as much as they do a third-party candidate, then they would support ranked choice voting. But the vast majority of them don't support it. Only, I believe, Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders, out of the Democratic primary candidates for president, supported it this time. Maybe Andrew Yang did, I'm not sure. Anyway, another crucial thing to point out is if the Democrats really, really wanted to beat Trump, they would nominate somebody or insist on whoever they nominated supporting policies with near universal appeal among Democratic or left-leaning voters, such as Medicare for All or the Green New Deal. I think Medicare for All has something like 90% support among Democratic or Democrat-leaning voters, as does the Green New Deal. Another thing we need to look at is, who does the Democratic Party or who does the DNC prioritize in terms of soliciting support for their presidential candidate? At the DNC convention, to give you an example, folks from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, people like AOC or Tulsi Gabbard or Ilhan Omar, Bernie Sanders, etc. Well, Bernie got a decent slot, but most of the people on the left wing of the Democratic Party were either not allowed to speak at or invited to speak at the Democratic national convention at all, or were given an extremely limited amount of time. And instead, numerous Republicans, such as extreme right-winger John Kasich and Iraq War promoter Colin Powell, got prominent speaking slots, as well as a former Republican who hasn't really changed his right-wing politics, Michael Bloomberg. And who did they nominate? Joe Biden, one of the most right-wing Democrats in modern history, who, to boot, makes racist comments on a regular basis. He's a sexual predator. He shows clear signs of cognitive decline, maybe dementia, but obviously somebody, a qualified mental health professional, would need to check him out at length in person in order to determine that. But he just doesn't seem like he's all there. He can't. He has trouble speaking coherently without a teleprompter. Sometimes even if he has a teleprompter, he flubs his lines or whatever. Sometimes he's forgotten what state he was in at the time, thinking he was in Vermont, for example, when he hadn't been to that state in years. One time he forgot what office he was running for. He forgot well-known lines from the Declaration of Independence, etc. And it really shows how desperate the Democrats were to stop Sanders that they rigged the election against him in favor of somebody like Joe Biden. And in addition, it shows how seriously they take the Me Too movement, not at all seriously. That they were willing to pick someone like Joe Biden and throw Tara Reade and the multiple other women who've accused Joe Biden of sexual harassment or worse under the bus. The narrative that we're presented with as to why we should vote for Joe Biden is that Democrats and all voters who aren't MAGA folks need to vote for Biden to save democracy from fascist Trump. We're going to have fascism, even though we have, Trump's been in office for 4 years and we don't have fascism now. Somehow we're going to automatically wind up with fascism if Trump is reelected. So we need to vote for Biden to save democracy, so to speak. Even though, as I just pointed out, we don't really have much of a democracy. To combat the racism that Trump supports, to save the environment, to support women, etc. But if the Democratic elite doesn't care nearly as much about who wins as rank and file moderate to liberal voters do, as I've just made the case is true, how true is this narrative that we have to vote for Biden to do these things? It's going to make a big difference if Biden gets elected. The reality is that the wealthy and powerful backers of Democrats are just as much a part of the ruling class, the 1%, so to speak, the people who mostly own the productive assets of this country, such as factories and real estate and banks and other big corporations. They're just as much a part of that as the Republicans are. There are tons of Democratic billionaires and millionaires. The main objective of the ruling class in this country and anywhere else is profits and wealth. That is the primary motivating force for people at the top. Everything else is secondary. And they can continue to grow their wealth regardless of whether Trump or Biden wins. Folks have made a lot of money under Trump. If you, I came across recently a graphic of the increase in the discrepancy in wealth between the people at the very top of the pyramid, the 0.01% or whatever, and everybody else since the 1980s, or I think it was the bottom 50% or something. Anyway, you see a steady increase in inequality since that time. It didn't matter whether a Republican or a Democrat was president or who controlled Congress or whatever, just a steady increase in inequality. So we are now at a point where things in this country are more unequal than they have ever been. Okay, well, why are so many people supporting Biden? Why is the majority of the ruling class supporting Biden, including a lot of Republicans, a lot of people from Bush's or Reagan's camps? Well, the faction that supports Biden might think Biden is preferable to Trump for the objective of securing ever-increasing profits and wealth for a number of possible reasons. Perhaps because he doesn't say things that disclose what the U.S. is really up to, like Trump does. So Trump says things like, "We want to take other countries' oil." We point the finger at a lot of other countries for bad things they've done, but we've committed a lot of violence against innocent people ourselves. He said things like that. People were like, "Oops, don't say that, Donald." The ruling elite says that. Biden's not as rude as Trump. He doesn't disparage people constantly on Twitter or whatever. Although he's pretty rude. He says things like, "Look, fat," or "If you don't vote for me, black people, you ain't black," etc. Biden, is consummate backer of U.S. foreign policy. Trump has dragged his feet at times, wanting to get troops out of Afghanistan, for example, and mostly the ruling class doesn't want that. Mostly, either they're part of the military or industrial complex, or in the back pockets of them, or aligned with them. But they don't have to worry about Biden unconditionally supporting the consensus of the ruling class about foreign policy. Biden's also more in line with ruling class consensus on trade policy. He's a supporter of free trade. So that's why most of them are siding with Biden. It's not because they think that it's not because they're worried about fascism. I mean, if you look back in history, it doesn't seem like the U.S. ruling class is all that worried about fascism. They don't truly think that Trump is a threat to democracy because, well, first of all, we don't have one anyway. But even though they may not be fascist, people like Joe Biden or Barack Obama or whoever, maybe technically they don't meet the definition of having a fascist ideology, but they don't support democracy. And at times they back fascism. Under both Democratic and Republican presidents, the U.S. has regularly undermined or overthrown democratically elected governments in other countries, or perhaps countries like Iraq or Libya, where you might quibble with whether their leaders were democratically elected, but they pursued a path independent of the United States and use their own resources, such as oil, to benefit their own people. And the U.S. Doesn't like for countries to do that because we want to. Our ruling class wants to be able to exploit those resources and those people. So often, the U.S. has supported literal fascists or right-wingers in other countries. The U.S. supported the fascist coup in Honduras in 2009 when Obama and Biden were in office, and they did so in Ukraine in 2014 when a fascist-dominated government took over in a military coup backed by the Obama administration. And there are many other examples, both before then and since then. We can talk about them some other time. Both parties rig elections. The Democrats have an inherently undemocratic primary process with the superdelegates who can basically vote to overturn the will of the voters to a considerable extent. And members of both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, have gone after journalists or whistleblowers like Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning who have exposed government corruption. How many elected officials besides Tulsi Gabbard and I believe Rand Paul have supported Julian Assange, who goes to court on whether he can be extradited on trumped-up charges to the U.S. tomorrow. The Democrats don't truly care all that much about the environment. They claim to, and there's some things that they're okay on, some of them anyway, some of the time. And they don't, for the most part, again, there's exceptions like Tulsi Gabbard or Bernie Sanders or AOC. But for the most part, the Democrats, like the Republicans, have no intention of taking anywhere near the needed steps to deal with climate change or other severe environmental problems. Obama and Biden had a horrible environmental record. They made the U.S. the #1 producer of oil and natural gas in the world, and the #1 country in the world in terms of fracking. And they presided over the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history, the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig, because there's just virtually non-existent regulation and safety inspections in the oil industry. It doesn't matter who's president. The Democrats also don't truly care about enacting economic policies that serve working people's interests beyond a limited extent, as the fact that twice now, both back in 2008, the Great Recession, and this year, during another severe and actually worse recession due to coronavirus, members of both parties in Congress have overwhelmingly backed plans to, quote, save the economy, that have shoveled billions of dollars at the wealthy, trillions, while aside from modestly generous unemployment compensation this time, they've given a relative pittance to the folks who need it most. So there was no possibility that universal basic income, which was favored by a handful of folks in Congress, was going to get passed or even brought up for consideration. If you look back at Obama and Biden's record on economic issues in office, they extended Bush's tax cuts. They tried to cut social programs. They cut some from welfare. They went 8 years without raising the minimum wage. There was an increase that went into effect during Obama's first year in office, but that was actually signed into law by Bush the preceding year, and there was no effort to push it any further than its current $7.25 an hour. Obviously, the Democrats don't care any more than the Republicans about peace, because the vast majority of members of both parties, politicians of both parties, vote for massive military budgets and wars on a regular basis. And it's really telling also that the Biden campaign has gone out of its way to court support from right-wingers like John Kasich or former Michigan Governor Rick Snyder. Just recently came out that he was endorsing Biden, and the Biden campaign was like, oh goody, the person responsible for poisoning the water in Flint, Michigan, who's still running around scot-free today, even though he committed literal crimes. They're super happy he's endorsing Biden. So I think folks really need to rethink the idea that American politics is about the Democrats versus the Republicans, because it's just really telling that the Democrats have not only rigged the electoral process to prevent progressive Democratic challengers such as Sanders from winning, but they've also rigged the process against third parties and focused all their enmity on third parties to their left, not their right. They don't care if a lot of people vote for the Libertarians. And this has a long history. The Communist Party was essentially strangled in the crib by McCarthyism in the 40s and 50s. And the Socialist Party also faced a lot of repression back in the early 1900s, with Eugene Debs famously running a presidential campaign from jail, where he was put by a Democratic administration for opposing World War I, speaking out against World War I. And the way we need to think about the American political system is not Democrats versus Republicans, but ruling class versus the rest of us. Joe Biden and Donald Trump are both part of that ruling class, as are Kamala Harris and Mike Pence and the Clintons and Obama and Pelosi and McConnell and journalists like Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity, and lots and lots of other people that you may or may not have heard of, depending on who they are, who are wealthy and or powerful. And sure, they don't march in lockstep. They may disagree on a lot of things, but there's one central thing that they all agree on. They all agree to work together to keep you down, unless you're in their little club, and keep the profits rolling in. Okay, let me see if I've gotten any comments. So it doesn't look like it. All right, well, I hope you've enjoyed and learned something from this segment, and I will see you next time. Please like and subscribe to the channel or the video, and comment if you have anything you want to say, and stay tuned for the next episode of The Bitter Pill.